No. Hang on. Hear me out because you are completely... Sorry, You are missing the absolute magic of what we're actually looking at here.
I am not missing anything. Are you joking?
Yeah.
We've both looked at the exact same text. We are looking at the exact same era of cinema. And frankly, I reckon you're romanticizing the absolute life out of it. The entire production is a complete shambles.
A shambles. You can't be serious. Look, if you're sitting on the tube right now, or maybe you're stuck in traffic, and you are just absolutely sick to the back teeth of modern cinema.
Oh, here we go with the modern cinema rant.
No, wait, think about it. How many times have you been to the pictures lately and thought, oh, right, another remake, another sequel, another completely soulless CGI-stuffed repackaging of a story I've already seen 5 times?
Well, yeah, I'll grant you the multiplex is a bit grim these days, but...
Dreadful. And if you are feeling that cinematic drudgery, I am telling you, I have found the cure. We are looking at this book today.
Cinema, the Magic Vehicle, a comprehensive guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
The Golden Age, the era where filmmakers were literally inventing the language of movies as they went along. Drama, comedy, sci-fi, film noir.
Yeah.
It is a proper time travel experience to read this.
Yeah.
And there is one specific artifact from the text from 1923 called the Covered Wagon. Mm-hmm. And it is an absolute bloody, brilliant masterpiece.
A masterpiece.
A proper masterpiece. It didn't just participate in the epic Western genre made. It practically invented the scale of it.
It did not invent the epic Western. That's rubbish. It just threw an astronomical, eye-watering amount of money at a very basic, creaky framework.
Oh, come on.
No, listen, exploring the Golden Age, digging into silent film masterpieces that evoke, strong emotions without a single line of spoken dialogue, it's all well and good. I am fully on board with that mission. But your current obsession with the Covered Wagon, it's completely misguided. If we take out the magnifying glass and actually zoom in on the historical record, the facts are glaring.
The facts are that it's a triumph.
The facts are that the story is rather dull, and the history it presents is completely dodgy in places. The text itself says the script is feeble, it's inconsistent. How on earth can you look me in the eye and call a film with a feeble, fundamentally broken script a proper masterpiece?
Because cinema isn't just about the bloody script. It's about the spectacle, the feeling, the sheer unadulterated innovation.
Innovation.
Yes. Look, we're not here today to hold hands and give a polite, dusty summary of a 1920s film like we're reading off a Wikipedia page. We're getting the magnifying glass out, and we are zooming right in on the dirt, the celluloid, and the absolute madness of this 1923 artifact.
Well, we're definitely zooming in on the dirt.
I want to prove to you, the listener, that this is a work of pure, intuitive genius, despite its flaws.
And I'm here to prove to you, the listener, that it is a massively overhyped piece of studio propaganda.
That's propaganda now.
Absolutely. Is it a fascinating historical document? Yes, absolutely. I'll grant you that all day long. But a masterpiece. That is nonsense. Let's simply look at the facts, starting with the man behind the camera. The director, James Cruze.
A brilliant mind.
Was who? He made this film for the famous Players-Lasky Corporation, which eventually became Paramount Pictures. Now, if you look at Cruze's actual track record, in his first 5 years as a director, the text explicitly states the man had not revealed any particular talent whatsoever.
Yeah.
5 years. Half a decade of churning out completely forgettable reels. And the historical consensus is clear, he didn't have much success afterward either.
Exactly, which makes the whole thing even more bloody brilliant. It's the ultimate underdog story.
Underdog. Mate, he was handed $500,000 by a major Hollywood studio.
So?
Do you know what $500,000 was in 1923? It was the GDP of a small island. That's not an underdog story. That's a corporate gamble that happened to pay off because of the sheer weight of the cash involved.
Money doesn't direct the picture.
It's like handing the keys to a Formula One car to a bloke who spent 5 years repeatedly failing his driving test, and somehow he miraculously wins Monaco. If a bloke has absolutely zero talent for half a decade before he makes a film, and then zero success after he makes it, that is the definition of a fluke. The studio's money did the heavy lifting here, not James Cruze.
Wait. Hold on a second. You're completely missing the mechanism of how he actually made it. You're missing the intuition.
Intuition?
Yes. The text says he was given considerable freedom by the studio, and he made a deeply personal film, seemingly through pure intuition. He didn't have a spreadsheet. He didn't have an algorithm telling him what a 4-quadrant audience wanted. He tapped into something raw.
He tapped into a massive budget.
Look at what he was up against. Before 1923, stories about the West were just Run-of-the-mill horse operas. Utter rubbish.
Well, they had a structure. Thomas H. Ince had practically built the factory town for them.
Right, but what kind of structure? Let's actually explain what Ince was doing between 1912 and 1916, because you love facts so much.
I do love facts.
Ince created the modern studio system of mass production. He had this place called Inceville.
Very modest name.
Very modest. And he introduced the detailed shooting script where every single shot, every angle, every cost was planned out before a camera ever rolled.
Which is how you run a successful business.
It was brilliant for efficiency, yeah, but it was basically an assembly line. He created the framework for the Western, but it hadn't been filled with any worthwhile content. The text says that. It was all structure, absolutely zero soul.
Okay, but...
Just cowboys chasing Indians around a backlot.
Right.
And then Cruze comes in with no previous experience in the genre, none, and relies purely on his intuition to blow up that assembly line and make something vast. That is mental. Think about that in today's terms.
I am thinking about it in today's terms, and it proves my point beautifully.
How does it prove your point?
Imagine a modern Hollywood studio today. They look at a director who has been churning out utter lifeless rubbish for 5 years. Nothing memorable, no critical acclaim, no box office smash, just filler. And the studio executives sit around a boardroom table and say, you know what? Let's give this talentless hack a $200 million equivalent blockbuster budget, total creative freedom, don't bother checking his shooting script, and just see what his intuition comes up with.
Whoa.
It wouldn't happen. It's absurd. The only reason it worked is because he was backed by the unparalleled resources of famous players Lasky.
Right.
It wasn't his intuitive genius. It was the fact that he could afford to ship his entire production out to Utah and Nevada, shoot on natural scenery, and hire thousands of actual Native Americans and locals as extras.
But the resources don't direct the film. Come on, you can hand a bad director 50 million quid today, and they'll still make a fundamentally bad film.
We see it all the time.
Exactly. We see it every single summer at the multiplex. A massive budget does not buy you a soul. Cruze took those resources and elevated the entire genre.
Elevated it.
Yes. He took the rubbish factory line horse opera that Ince built and gave it actual scale. He made it personal. The records show he paid incredible attention to simplicity, authenticity, warmth, and humor.
Warmth and humor.
Yes. You don't get warmth and humor from a studio checkbook. You can't buy authenticity. You get that from a director who fundamentally understands humanity.
Oh, understands humanity. Right, okay. Let's talk about how well James Cruze understood humanity by looking at the actual script he was working from.
The script is fine.
Because if we are putting a magnifying glass on this supposed masterpiece, the cracks show up the second you look at the plot.
It's an epic adventure.
It is a shambles. The story is set in 1848. A massive wagon train leaves what is now Kansas City for a 2,000-mile trek across the untamed wilderness to Oregon.
Brilliant setting.
The script was written by Jack Cunningham and James Cruze, adapted from a novel by Emerson Hart, and the source text literally calls it feeble and inconsistent. It has the most painfully conventional treatment of characters and their motivation you could possibly imagine.
It needs broad archetypes,
Yeah.
so the audience can project themselves onto the journey.
Let me finish. Listen to this plot and tell me this isn't a shambles. Our hero is Will Banion.
Played by J. Warren Kerrigan.
Right. He's this strapping lad entirely in love with Molly Wingate, played by Lois Wilson. But oh no, Molly's fiancé is the villainous Sam Woodhull.
Alan Hale.
Yes, Alan Hale, who has a mustache practically designed for twirling. Sam wants Molly, so he sets up Will. He gets Will falsely accused of stealing horses.
A massive crime back then.
Stealing horses on a wagon train, it's the ultimate sin. So Will is disgraced. He's kicked out of the army, banished from the wagon train, and left to fend for himself in the wilderness.
High stakes.
And what does our tragic banished hero do? He just happens to hear news of the gold rush kicking off in California. So he thinks, right, I'll just nip over to California.
Well, he had to go somewhere.
He goes, finds gold almost immediately, gets incredibly wealthy, is miraculously exonerated of the horse-stealing crime back on the trail, and then just casually travels all the way up to Oregon to reunite with Molly and live happily ever after. That is rubbish made.
It's a sweeping adventure. People wanted escapism.
It's structurally absurd. Think about the geography.
They're overthinking it.
A man gets banished into the harsh wilderness in 1848, decides to take a massive detour hundreds of miles south to mine for gold in California, strikes it rich, and just pops back up to Oregon with a heavy purse to get the girl.
He's a resourceful bloke.
It's completely unbelievable. It removes all the tension of the pioneer struggle, and it's factually dodgy. The historical analysis points out a massive glaring error right in the middle of the film.
Which is
The villain leads the wagon train into a trap in a box canyon.
a classic Western trope.
Yes, a trope. But no genuine pioneer, no wagon master in 1848, would ever lead a massive train of oxen and wagons into a narrow canyon where they could be ambushed. It goes against every single rule of plain survival.
It looked dramatic on screen.
Cruze couldn't eliminate the banality of Cunningham's script. That's what the text says. If your script is banal, if the plot is feeble, if the character motivations are inconsistent, and your history is factually dodgy, you do not have a masterpiece. You have a very expensive, very long soap opera on horseback.
Hear me out. You are doing it again. You are judging a 1923 silent epic by the standards of a modern, gritty HBO character drama.
I'm judging it by basic narrative logic.
You don't watch The Covered Wagon for a nuanced psychological deconstruction of Will Banion's inner trauma. You don't watch it for hyper-realistic geography. You watch it for the sweeping, visceral experience of the adventure.
The adventure of popping over to California for a quick bag of gold.
Over their struggle with hunger, over the bad weather, over the sheer exhaustion. Cruze actually develops the story visually. They face a massive prairie fire. They face crossing the River Platte.
I'll admit the set pieces are large.
Large. The sheer scale of what they are depicting, a 2,000-mile track in 1848. I mean, have you ever really thought about how mental it is to undertake that journey?
It was incredibly dangerous, yes.
Dangerous doesn't even begin to cover it. A fortnight on the prairie with no modern medicine, no roads, no clear maps. You've just got wooden wagons, oxen, and whatever you can carry. And they went 2,000 miles. Just the physical act of filming that on location in 1923 is a triumph. Think about the logistics. They were out in Utah and Nevada, miles away from Hollywood studios. They had to deal with the elements. They had to manage hundreds of extras living in tents, capturing that struggle practically.
With a massive budget.
But there was no CGI to paint in a prairie fire. They had to light a fire. The simplicity, the authenticity of the mud and the sweat, the warmth of the community surviving together, that totally overrides a banal script about a bloke going to California for gold. You feel the dust in your teeth when you watch it.
Okay, let's pause and actually look at the contradiction you're defending here, because this is fascinating.
Sort of contradiction.
It is. If the script is a shambles, and we've established from the source that the plot is a feeble, inconsistent mess with utterly conventional characters, how on earth did this become the very first famous epic of pioneer America?
I just told you. The visuals.
How does a film with a banal script, shot by a director with no prior talent, become a historic touchstone that defined Hollywood for decades?
Because of the technical execution. This is exactly where the magnifying glass comes in. If you zoom in on the technical specs of how this film was put together, it is properly genius. First of all, it's 2,867 meters of film.
Which is incredibly long for the era. That's pushing 90 minutes or more, depending on the projection speed. Which, to be fair, was a massive undertaking for an audience used to much shorter features.
Exactly. It was an event, and it was shot entirely in natural scenery. It dispensed with the cheap patriotic declarations and flag waving that earlier films relied on.
Well, we'll get to the patriotism later.
But it didn't need title cards screaming about American destiny every 5 minutes because the landscape did the talking. It had this quasi-documentary narrative tone. And look at the team Cruze assembled. He wasn't working in a vacuum. He brought in Dorothy Arzner to edit the picture.
Now, Dorothy Arzner is a genuinely fascinating figure.
She's a total legend. She was a pioneering female editor in an industry completely dominated by men, and she later became a highly successful director in her own right.
Yes, she did.
She used imaginative editing, heavily influenced by the example of D.W. Griffith. She understood how to take miles and miles of footage of wagons moving across a plain and give it a rhythm.
To clarify for the listener, when we say she followed Griffith's example, we're talking about the birth of modern continuity editing and parallel action.
Cross-cutting.
Griffith pioneered the idea of cross-cutting, yes.
Yeah.
You show the wagon train struggling through the mud. Cut to the impending danger, the fire, or the ambush gathering in the distance. Cut back to the wagons.
It builds the tension.
The audience's heart rate goes up because the editor is controlling the flow of time and space. Arzner took a 2,000-mile journey and paced it so it felt epic, but not exhausting. She gave the landscape a pulse.
Spot on. She is the unsung hero of this film. And then, and this is the absolute kicker, the thing that proves Cruze's intuition, There's Carl Brown's photography.
I will concede that Carl Brown's work as the cinematographer here is highly notable.
Notable. It's revolutionary. The historical record specifically calls out an independent night sequence that Brown photographed, a campfire scene in the dark. It is cited as a really remarkable thing in 1923 when panchromatic stock was not yet available. That is massive.
It is technically impressive, but for the listener to truly understand why that matters, we have to look under the hood at the chemistry of early film stock.
Oh, here comes the science lesson.
It's important. In 1923, the industry standard was orthochromatic film. Now, orthochromatic emulsion relies on silver halides that are highly sensitive to blue and ultraviolet light, but they are completely blind to red light.
Right. Hold on. Let me translate this.
I wasn't finished. The chemistry is vital here.
I know, but if we don't translate the chemistry, we lose them. So what you're saying is the film literally couldn't see warm colors.
Exactly. Red would show up as pitch black. Yellows and oranges were incredibly dark. Blue skies would wash out completely white.
Wow.
That meant it was incredibly difficult to shoot in low light or capture natural contrast without massive artificial studio lighting to balance it out. If you wanted to shoot a night scene, you usually shot it in broad daylight and just tinted the film blue afterward.
Day for night.
Yes, day for night.
Right. So it's like trying to paint a realistic landscape.
Yeah.
But you're forced to wear blue-tinted sunglasses.
Yeah.
And half the colors on your palette are missing.
That's actually a fairly accurate analogy, yes. Panchromatic film, which became the standard later in the decade, is sensitive to all colors of the visible spectrum. It allows for much better low-light shooting, night shooting, and natural skin tones. But Brown didn't have that.
Exactly. He didn't have. So just picture the scene. They are out in the actual wilderness in Utah. No massive studio arc lamps, no controlled environments, and they are shooting a massive set piece at night around a campfire, capturing the faces of the pioneers in the dark without the modern film stock that makes night shooting possible.
He had to be very creative.
They had to innovate on the spot, using whatever reflectors or flares they could engineer to expose that orthochromatic film. Add that to the other massive set pieces they captured. The buffalo hunt. Have you ever tried to direct a herd of buffalo?
I can't say that I have.
Nobody has. And the crossing of the River Platte, where wagons are literally floating and sinking in a massive rushing river. These aren't just little scenes filmed on a backlot. These are logistical nightmares captured on celluloid.
They are impressive sequences.
The history books say these scenes have their own independent value. The natural scenery, the terrifying set pieces, Arzner's Griffith-style editing. It creates this quasi-documentary freshness. That is the genius of James Cruze's intuition. He knew how to put all these brilliant elements and these brilliant people together out in the dirt.
But did he put them together into a masterpiece?
Yes.
You just used the exact phrase yourself from the text. Some scenes have their own independent value. Independent, meaning they stand alone.
So,
A brilliant logistical nightmare of a buffalo hunt and a clever, chemically innovative night shot do not automatically knit together to make a proper masterpiece if the glue holding them together is a feeble, banal romance about a bloke who gets banished and miraculously finds gold in California.
you're hung up on the gold.
Because it's ridiculous. Look, I'm not denying that Arzner's editing is spot on. I'm not denying that Brown's cinematography is a technical marvel. But a film has to be a cohesive whole.
It is cohesive.
If you have to excuse the script, excuse the factual errors, excuse the completely unbelievable geography, and excuse the conventional characters just to appreciate a river crossing, then what you have is a great technical exercise, a milestone in production logistics, but not a great film.
But the flaws are part of the charm. If you consider the picture as an epic adventure story with its freshness, its naturalness, and that quasi-documentary narrative tone, all those shortcomings are completely forgivable. We forgive flaws in art all the time when the ambition is this colossal.
Forgivable doesn't mean non-existent. And if we're going to talk about what's forgivable, we need to pull back from the micro level of film stock and editing techniques and look at the macro level impact of this film.
Oh.
Because this is where the so-called magic of this 1923 vehicle gets incredibly deeply dodgy.
Oh, here we go. You're going to bring down the mood. We were just talking about crossing rivers and buffalo hunts, and now you're going to get cynical.
I'm not being cynical. I am reading the history exactly as the cultural analysts present it in our source.
Yeah.
Let's drop the aesthetic debate about Dorothy Arzner's editing for a second and be purely, coldly analytical about what this film actually functioned as in 1920s America.
It functioned as entertainment.
It cost over $500,000 to produce.
A colossal sum.
Unbelievably massive. And it became one of the most financially successful films ever released up to that point. It was an absolute juggernaut. It became an icon, which was, to quote the historians, mercilessly copied.
Because it was brilliant.
But why was it so successful? What was the cultural appetite that made a 1923 audience line up around the block to see a film with a banal script? The cultural analysis of the era provides a very clear answer.
Go on, then.
The Western genre in the 1920s wasn't built for social analysis. It wasn't there to critique America. It was designed entirely to show the unquestionable victory of good over evil and to provide an enthusiastic, breathless description of the conquest of new territories.
Right. It was about optimism. It was about the idea of progress, the frontier spirit.
It was a highly funded, $500,000 myth-making machine. Think about the socio-political climate of the 1920s. You have millions of immigrants arriving in the United States from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, all over the world.
True.
They're passing through Ellis Island. They come from dozens of different nations, different cultures, speaking different languages. America in the 1920s is trying to figure out how to assimilate this massive, diverse influx of people into one cohesive national identity. And what is the most powerful tool they have?
Silent cinema.
Silent cinema.
Because it's a universal language.
Yeah.
You don't need to speak English to understand a pioneer fighting a prairie fire.
Exactly. The Western genre, based on this highly sanitized myth of the West, became a powerful force for national integration. It was aimed primarily at uniting white immigrants from many nations.
Melting pot.
Yes, but a very specific melting pot. It was an easily accessible carrier of the idea of optimism, democracy, and progress. It was essentially an assimilation tool. You sit a room full of new arrivals in a dark theater, and the screen gives them a unified, optimistic, democratic fiction to believe in. Here's your new shared history. We are all Americans now. Good conquers evil. We conquered the brutal wilderness through sheer grit and community.
And what is wrong with that?
What's wrong with it?
Creating a shared national identity out of thin air in a fortnight of cinema going. Giving people hope. Showing them a story of survival that binds them together. That's the absolute power of the medium. That's why we go to the movies.
What's wrong with it is who gets completely erased to build that myth. The historical analysis points out a crucial, incredibly harmful element of this so-called optimism. In order for the pioneers to represent the unquestionable victory of good, they need an evil to conquer.
Right.
And in the Covered Wagon, the Native Americans are portrayed as invariably wicked.
Yeah, that is tough to watch now.
Invariably wicked. The entire myth of optimism and progress relies on taking the indigenous population, who were being systematically displaced and destroyed in reality, and reducing them to nothing more than savage villains blocking the path of progress.
Okay, I hear that. It is dodgy.
Now, any responsible cultural historian will impartially note that at that time, in 1923, any other treatment would have been virtually inconceivable to a Hollywood studio. The text says that explicitly. We have to view it through the ideological lens of the 1920s. We aren't here to moralize from the 21st century.
Exactly. We can't judge them by today's standards.
But as analysts, as people genuinely looking back at this magic vehicle of cinema, we have to ask a difficult question. If a film's very foundation is built on historical erasure, if its primary function in society was ideological assimilation through a simplified, dodgy history, can we still celebrate it as a masterpiece of art? Or is it just a very effective piece of nation-building propaganda?
We can celebrate it.
How?
Because we are capable of holding two thoughts in our heads at the exact same time. We can acknowledge that the tropes are incredibly dodgy by today's standards. We can recognize that the portrayal of Native Americans is a gross simplification meant to serve a narrative purpose. The history itself says it was inconceivable to do it differently then, which means we recognize it as a rigid artifact of its era.
It is an artifact, yes.
But you cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I'm not throwing it out, I'm contextualizing it.
But you're stripping it of its magic. The massive financial success, the fact that audiences all over the world flocked to it, the way it was mercilessly copied by every other studio, that proves it struck a fundamental, universal chord of human resilience.
It struck a chord because it was a simple myth.
It wasn't just white immigrants in New York who responded to the idea of struggling against the elements. The idea of surviving a prairie fire, braving a raging river, stepping out into the terrifying unknown. That is a universal human narrative. It predates America. It goes back to the Odyssey.
The Odyssey didn't have a $500,000 studio budget.
The propaganda element is there, yes. But the survival element, the human endurance captured so brilliantly by Dorothy Arzner's editing and Carl Brown's photography in that quasi-documentary style that transcends the politics of 1923. That's why it is remembered as a great classic Western, not just a forgotten propaganda reel.
It struck a chord because it was easy. It is always much easier to sell a myth of guaranteed optimism and progress than it is to engage in actual messy social analysis, which the 1920s Western avoided entirely.
People didn't want social analysis in 1923.
It was accessible because it was utterly simple. You have the good guys in the wagons, the bad guys in the canyon, a clear geographical destination, and quite literally a pot of gold waiting at the end in California for Will Banion.
Still hung up on the gold.
Because it represents the sheer banality of it all. Look, I don't deny its historical importance. I would never argue it shouldn't be studied. As an icon that established the framework, the visual grammar for decades of cinema, it is absolutely vital.
So you agree it's a masterpiece?
No, I still maintain that James Cruze was not an intuitive genius. He was a lucky director who stumbled into a massive cultural sweet spot with a $500,000 safety net, using impressive natural scenery to mask a feeble script.
And I still insist you are severely underestimating the sheer intuition and grit it takes to marshal those resources, capture that raw authenticity, and deliver an epic that literally defined a genre for a century.
Defined a genre of horse operas.
The Covered Wagon is exactly why studying this era is so brilliant. It forces us to look at these massive foundational pillars of film history warts, dodgy history, and recognize the sheer audacity of what they accomplished. No digital effects, no modern film stock, just heavy wooden cameras in the mud on a 2,000-mile trek.
Well, we are clearly not going to reach a consensus on Mr. Cruze's genius today.
Definitely not. But that's the beauty of looking back at this stuff. So we turn it over to you, listening right now.
Yes, over to you.
Think about that 2,000-mile trek from Kansas City to Oregon in 1848. If you were forced to spend a fortnight trekking across the prairie, facing starvation, bad weather, and the sheer terror of the unknown, what would you want playing in your head?
An interesting premise.
Would you rather have a sweeping, optimistic myth of guaranteed victory to keep you putting one foot in front of the other? Or would you want the cold, hard, unromantic, factual truth of the survival odds?
It's a very fair question, and it leads us to one final thought for you to mull over. The historical record explicitly states that the Covered Wagon became an icon which was mercilessly copied.
Over and over.
If that is true, if this 1923 film is essentially the DNA of the cinematic blockbuster, how many of our modern, beloved cinematic tropes, the ones we gladly pay 20 quid to see at the multiplex today, are actually just echoes of a feeble and inconsistent script that got lucky with a massive budget?
Wow.
Are we still a century later just sitting in the dark watching James Cruze's mistakes repeated over and over again?
Brilliant question. Cheers to that.